QSO Today episode 207, Mike Mussler AI8Z. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers for every level of amateur radio operator, and by QRP Labs, makers of the QCX single-band transceiver kit for under $50. Please support the QSO Today podcast by supporting these fine sponsors. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth for Z1UG, your host. Mike Mussler AI8Z is one of the early pioneers in the 630-meter band experimental trials in 2007 that resulted in the band being opened for amateur radio exploration. AI8Z rebuilds old rigs, especially military surplus World War II vintage radios that adorn his Cortez, Colorado ham shack. We start today with Mike's ham radio story in this QSO Today. AI8Z, this is Eric for Z1UG. Are you there, Mike?
For Z1UG, this is AI8Z. I'm here.
Mike, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, thinking back, I'd have to say the beginnings were with Cub Scouts. And back in the 60s in the Wolf handbook, there was a crystal set project. And I attempted to build that, and I'd have to say it was probably my first entry into radio.
And do you remember anything about that crystal set? Was that a cat's whisker or germanium diode? Or
it was a cat's whisker, and I used my bed springs for the antenna and a cold water pipe for the ground. And I think an uncle had an old set of headphones from a crystal set that he built when he was a kid, and I used those with the one I built.
And what was the hometown? Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Elyria, Ohio, which is west of Cleveland, north part of Ohio.
Okay, and in Elyria, Ohio, were there a lot of hams?
There were a number of hams, but one of the challenges for me becoming a ham was to connect with them, and it took me a while to make that connection.
So when you finally made that connection, how did that happen, and how old were you?
Well, eventually I discovered a new neighbor in our neighborhood, and what looked to be a ham radio antenna behind his house, and I got up the courage to knock on his door, and it turned out to be the Russian language teacher in our junior high school. And he was a fairly young guy and took me under his wings to help me get my ham license. That was 1970, and I was 14 years old at the time.
That was when you were taken under wing. Do you remember his call sign?
Yes, W8BWE, Bravo Whiskey Echo, Dave Bellheimer. And he's still an active ham, and actually came across him in one of my QRP activities here recently. So kind of an interesting full circle experience.
Well, that's pretty amazing. So you got your first license in 1970 at the age of 14. And was that a novice license?
Well, I actually started learning the code at the end of 1970 with Dave as my mentor, or Elmer. And let's see, I think I took the test in early 71, and the license arrived in March of 71. And that was a novice license. I actually took the test in Dave's basement.
What was your call sign?
WN8JJA, June, July, August.
And how did you spend your novice time?
I did. It was pretty challenging. I didn't have the world's best receiver, and I had an old... Actually, it was a Amico AC1 single tube transmitter kit that I built. And I called CQ probably a couple of weeks before Dave kind of stepped in and realized I wasn't hearing people calling me back. So he loaned me a receiver that he had and wasn't using, and my activity really took off from that point.
What kind of receiver was that?
It was a National NC 125 from the early 50s.
Did your high school have an active amateur radio club, or were you the only ham?
As far as I know, I was the only ham in my high school, but I soon hooked up with a number of hams from a neighboring high school that did have a club station. And we got pretty involved with contests, and we had roundtable schedules on the air. And I think probably the big thing was the sweepstakes and field day activities that we did as a group.
And this is not a club, or was this a club, or did you guys make a club out of this, or did you just become kind of a group of guys that got together for these activities?
No, it was a formal club. They had a science high school teacher in their school that sponsored their radio club and actually got some space to set up a station. And they actually had some fairly decent equipment that they could use. And were encouraged to get their licenses, and I think there were probably half dozen to a dozen members in their school club, and that made for a pretty good group for doing contests like sweepstakes and field days.
Now, did you upgrade right away?
Well, I did. It took me about 9 months to get the code speed up, and the other barrier to that was in Ohio, we didn't have a field office full time. They had a visiting a couple of people from the FCC that periodically would give the exams, I think twice a year in Cleveland. And so, not being old enough to drive, had to hook up with an adult that could drive us there and take time off from work. And myself and a couple of the other club members traveled to Cleveland to do that. And I think we actually took the test in the federal building downtown Cleveland.
So WN8JJA became WA8JJA or WB8?
Well, it turned out they were already into the WB8s, but there was no WA8JJA, and I figured that would be the one I'd get when I upgraded, but that was not the case. I became WB8JJA. I think it was January of 72.
And did you upgrade your station by that time?
I did. With the help of another neighborhood, Elmer, the summer of 71, I believe, built the homebrew transmitter that I still have to this day. It was fashioned after ARRL handbook article in the mid-60s and built from surplus TV set and military surplus parts that I scrounged around the neighborhood. And with the help of my two Elmers, learned how to use a drill press and some of the other shop skills needed to build that particular rig.
Now, this particular rig, was it CW only? And was that where you stayed, or did you go to single sideband?
Well, it was really, I was still a novice when I built that summer. And so it was strictly a CW rig, but it did have the capability for screen modulation, but we did not build that capability into it. And I continued to use that rig with the addition of a VFO when I upgraded to General, probably for another 2 years.
So that really, as a general, you didn't go right to voice. You really spent some time on your CW skills. Did you become a contester at that point?
Well, I became a contester as a novice with the high school group. And I'd have to say that CW was, in the beginning for me, something I viewed as a necessary impediment to other ham radio activities like single sideband. Mm-hmm. But not having the resources to get a sideband rig, I stuck with CW, and to be honest, I became hooked on it. By the time I did get a sideband rig, I found that I didn't really enjoy that too much, and just really stuck with CW over the years.
What was your favorite contest in those days?
Well, I'd have to say Field Day. That was really the high point of the ham radio year.
Because of the activity, all of the activity that goes along with Field Day, including hanging out and food?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a camaraderie aspect to it, and you get a bunch of young guys together. I think at that age, you tend to be pretty competitive, and we really enjoyed seeing how we could do against the more aged ham population or clubs in the area. And to set up stations in the field, tents and antennas and that sort of thing, it was really a good time. And I really remember fondly those days and the people that we did that with.
Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Most definitely it did. It really opened up a world of possibilities for me, and I think a lot of people my age could say that as well.
I see that you spent a stint in the Merchant Marine. What is the Merchant Marine, and what did you do in it?
Well, virtually everything that our country imports comes on ships, and the Merchant Marine is the group of people that operate those, and that would also include fishing vessels and research ships and that sort of thing.
Can you tell me a little bit more about what it is and what did you do in it?
For me, it really wasn't something that I knew a lot about when I was in high school, but I found out from a family friend that one of the federal academies is the Merchant Marine Academy, and it was created during World War II to supply merchant marine officers for the wartime effort. And it was really my ticket for a college education. I really didn't have the means to pursue that otherwise, and was able to get an appointment and attend the academy at Kings Point, New York. And from there, learned about really what the Merchant Marine's all about. And it's, again, it's really a commercial activity. Oil tankers, again, some of the cargo ships and that sort of thing are all operated by merchant mariners. And in times of war, historically, they've nationalized part of that fleet for the wartime efforts, which was the case during World War II, and I think to a limited extent during the Vietnam War. So in the 70s, that was sort of an alternative to military service if you were considering that. So that was really my entry into, I guess, that phase of life and the reason I did that.
Did you serve aboard ship?
Yes, part of the 4-year program was what they called the sea year, and we spent an entire year at sea as cadets on operating merchant ships, and got a chance to really visit several ports around the world and experience travel at an age when that wasn't very common in those days. And then the other 3 years were spent working towards a Bachelor of Science degree.
From where?
From the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. So, and then I guess the third aspect of that was we were all commissioned in the U.S. Naval Reserve. So we had some military training that went with the program as well.
And in case America went to war, although at that period of time I think America was pretty through with Vietnam, then you could be called back into service.
Yes, that's true. Vietnam was still winding down. I think some of the upperclassmen had made voyages to Vietnam before Saigon fell. But pretty much by the time I got out of school or graduated from there, we were in a time of peace. So it was strictly commercial activities at that point.
What kind of dog do you have?
He's an English Springer Spaniel. You could probably hear him in the background.
I heard him, yeah. I have 2 of them sitting here.
Springer Spaniels?
Yeah, I love them. They're amazing dogs.
He's the third one we've had, and I call him the radio dog. He's typically seeks me out when I'm at the rig on the air.
Well, I heard his feet on the floor just a few minutes ago while you were talking about the Merchant Marine Academy, so I thought I'd ask you. Okay, so obviously ham radio played a part in the choices that you made. Now, I saw that on your LinkedIn page that your degree came from another entity other than the Merchant Marine Academy. Did the Merchant Marine Academy use another university?
Well, no, they didn't. After going to sea, I had a few years after I graduated from the academy that I spent at sea, and it was the period of time when the industry was transitioning from more traditional things like celestial navigation and Morse code HF communications to satellite-based systems. And I decided, it might be an interesting career path to go into that area. So after a few years at sea, I ended up going back to school and getting my double E degree at the University of Akron.
I see. But when you were at sea, you were a radio operator?
No, I was a ship's officer, deck officer, third mate, second mate, mostly navigation when we were at sea, and then cargo operations when we were in port.
Oh, interesting. So they never took advantage of your radio skills.
That was a separate job description on the ship. So they had a radio officer, but they had a different training path and a different union that they belonged to when they manned the ships. And it really wasn't directly connected with the school that I went to or the program that I was in. That being said, there was a time during World War II when they actually trained radio operators at the academy, but when the war ended, that part of the program went away.
Now, were you able to operate amateur radio from ships at sea?
Yes, I was very fortunate, both as a cadet and afterwards, to get permission to operate maritime mobile from the ships that I was on, and mostly did that with a QRP rig and on CW strictly. Never operated phone from the ships, but that was quite an experience and really an enjoyable activity when there really weren't too many other free time activities to kind of follow up on when we were at sea.
Did you operate any of the contests from sea?
No, it was strictly just random contacts, and occasionally we would handle messages for other crew members or get information on like World Series scores and that sort of thing.
You came to my attention because you wrote an article last year in QST, Portable Keyboard Interface for CW and Data Modes. What struck me about reading the article and stuff is that you're a QRP operator, and I saw that you are a member of the Colorado QRP Club. So from my research, you apparently like QRP. Why QRP and not, some of the high power CW activities that you could be doing?
Well, I think the biggest attraction to it is the mobility that you have with QRP, and you can take it into the field in places that it's really not possible to operate at the higher power levels, not easily at least. And my wife and I enjoy camping and traveling, and it's just a good, marriage of techniques with those activities.
Well, you mentioned before we started recording that you're in Cortez, Colorado now, which kind of puts you out in the boonies. Is there a lot of opportunity in the area that you're in to actually get out into nature and take the radio with you?
Yes, and that was one of the attractions to relocating here. There's a number of national parks and national monuments within maybe a couple hours drive from our home QTH, and then a couple of national forests, BLM land, and the Indian reservations also offer opportunities to do things like Summits on the Air activations.
And now let's take a moment for this message from ICOM America. Heard it, worked it, logged it. It's time to get the ICOM transceiver that is best suited for your lifestyle. ICOM offers a variety of high-performance and innovative transceivers that fit your ham radio budget. See how you can make the most out of contest season with one of these fine transceivers. The IC7851 has the competitive edge that you've been looking for. Raise the bar and hear what others cannot with this flagship HF and 50 MHz transceiver. This is due to ICOM engineers focusing on new local oscillators design that drastically reduces phase noise. This noise reduction and purity of LO results in an RMDR of 110 dB, allowing you to hear the extremely weak signals, making the IC7851 the perfect rig for making contacts at the bottom of the sunspot cycle. In addition, this fine rig has reciprocal mixing dynamic range, crystal clear LO design, spectrum scope, dual receivers, and a digital voice recorder. The IC7610 is the SDR every ham wants, and just in time for contest season. This high-performance SDR has the ability to pick out the faintest signals even in the presence of stronger adjacent signals. The new ICOM 7610 is a direct sampling software-defined radio that will change the world's definition of an SDR transceiver. Its features include an RF direct sampling system, 110 dB RMDR, independent dual receivers, and dual digicell. The IC7300 has changed the way that an entry-level HF transceiver is designed. This rig is a high-performance, innovative high-frequency transceiver with a compact design that will far exceed your expectations. It includes RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, a large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, real-time spectrum scope, internal antenna tuner, and an SD card memory slot. So no matter which ICOM rig you choose, you'll be a winner. Be sure to check out these fine rigs at www.icomamerica.com, and when you finally go to make your ICOM purchase, be sure to tell the dealer that you heard it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. Now, are you in Cortez proper, or are you actually out in the boonies even farther from town? And are you taking advantage in that case of the real estate to put up big antennas and all that stuff to be able to operate your shack?
We're actually about 3.5 miles north of the outskirts of Cortez. So we are out in the countryside and pretty much surrounded by irrigated hay fields. So there is space here to do pretty much any kind of antenna installation you could think of. And the neighboring properties are far enough apart that I don't have to worry about either causing them interference or vice versa. So the area was attractive from that standpoint as well.
And what did you put up there?
Well, it's really a temporary antenna at this point. It's a 160-meter doublet. It's on military surplus antenna mass, and it really needs to be on a higher support system to really get decent performance from it.
Do you have trees that you can use for hanging these antennas, or are you actually out on the field?
The trees that we have are really close to the house and surround the house, but out in the fields it's pretty open, and I'm a little bit hesitant to use the trees as antenna supports. I've done that in the past, but especially with sort of being out in the open, I'm concerned about wind and weather-related issues with that. So really the challenge is to come up with some permanent supports that I can use for antenna projects here.
Let's go back to QRP for a second. What's the rig that you take out into the field?
Well, there's a couple of them, but the one I like the best is KX2 that I've had for about a year or a couple years now. And I like it because it's self-contained and including the battery, and lightweight and very easy to pack in a rucksack and pretty much take any place you'd want to go.
Now, from your QST article, do you take the portable keyboard and do you operate the digital modes with the KX2 in the field?
We do take the keyboard along, and really that capability was aimed more at my wife and allowing her to participate in the Summits on the Air activations and other activities from the field. I'm not really, I do like trying the digital modes, but my favorite mode, again, is CW, and I don't really find it necessary to use the keyboard for that, but it really enabled my wife to participate in that aspect of the hobby.
Now, you sent me some amazing pictures of your ham shack, and your ham shack is loaded with vintage gear, some military surplus. How did that collection start? And do you do your own restoration?
Yes, I do my own restoration, and the military surplus gear, at least, has just been a accumulation over the years, picked up at swap meets or from other friends that are interested in that aspect of the hobby. And I guess the attraction comes from my earlier days with homebrew equipment, and a lot of people back in that time frame modified military surplus equipment to get on the air, and it was just sort of a natural progression, I guess, or interest that I had to get into that aspect of the hobby, and just lucky enough to come across those things as time went on.
What do you think is your most unusual military surplus radio?
Well, I would have to say the ART-13 transmitter. It was a long-range communications transmitter that they carried on the bombers during World War II. And it was one of the first, if not the first, auto-tune radio. It could be set up to change bands and frequencies from the pilot, from the cockpit. Didn't specifically need a radio operator to operate the thing. So it's a electromechanical marvel, and sort of fascinating to watch the knobs turn by themselves as you set up the different selections on the front panel.
So do you have the remote panel that goes with that?
I do not, but there's a panel switch that can select those preset positions, and it pretty much does the same function that you would have from the pilot remote control box.
And what you say that you restore old rigs, and obviously there, I'll put the picture in the show notes. What's the most interesting old rig that you've restored, and what do you like about it?
Well, I guess I'd have to say probably the ART-13 and the BC-348 receiver that I use with that. They required different power supplies than what they would use in an aircraft. I didn't really want to go with the dynamotor approach for the noise and current requirements, so you had to build a power supply to operate both of those radios. And it's getting to be kind of a challenge to find the components to do that sort of thing today, the high voltage transformers and capacitors. And then just the general tricks of the trade, so to speak, for maintaining and doing upgrades or modifications to that equipment.
Now, would you say that on your homebrew workbench that restoration of this kind of stuff is your primary activity, or are you headed in other directions now?
No, I'd have to say mostly the homebrew effort is just that. It's building other accessories or radios for the station, and that's really primarily what the lab equipment's used for in my setup.
Now, everything in the picture, are all of those radios operational? And do you have to move them around to do that, or do you actually have it set up so that you can actually go to a station and just operate it?
Yeah, everything in the photograph or the station is operational, and I have different operating positions. So I've got radios paired up with receivers, and I have a homebrew remote controlled coax switch that selects the different radios, and then another switch, similar kind of a thing for the antennas, when I had multiple antennas up at the previous location.
Now, in order to do this restoration, you must have a metal shop as well?
Really nothing fancy. It's pretty much a drill press, a vise, some tin snips, a lot of things that the average shop might have on hand.
But you don't have a metal bender? Or...
I don't. In recent projects, I've used angled aluminum stock to build up chassis and that sort of thing. And the coax switch, interestingly enough, was an aluminum cake pan that I found on, I think it was Amazon or one of the online outlets, and it was a perfect fit for the circuit board and components that went inside that.
Now, do you have a source of supply for high voltage transformers, as you mentioned earlier?
It's pretty much things that I've cannibalized over the years or picked up at swap meets. There are a couple of surplus places that maintain an inventory of transformers, but not a huge selection in terms of voltage ratings and that sort of thing. Probably, if somebody's looking to build up a power supply like that, your best bet's to go to the local swap meets and look under the tables. That's where a lot of that stuff came from that I have in my junk box, so to speak.
The stuff that's too heavy to put on the table.
Yes, it's more conveniently stored in like the garage or the basement kind of a location.
Now your test bench is in one of the pictures. What's your favorite piece of test equipment?
Well, there's a couple of them, but probably the handiest is that spectrum analyzer, and that coupled with a signal generator, especially one that you can use to track the spectrum analyzer, really makes for a handy way to test all kinds of things from filters to receivers to exciters and pretty much any accessory you could think of for a ham station.
We were speaking earlier about Colorado. I lived in Colorado for 16 years and was not an active ham. And now that I'm gone, I see that Colorado hams are really active and have all kinds of things that they're doing from one end of the state to the other. Are you involved with a Colorado group now in Cortez? And are you a volunteer examiner or doing any of those activities?
Yes, I am involved with a local ham radio group. It's not as formal a club as previous ones we've belonged to, but it's a gathering of people once a month at one of the local restaurants, and the purpose is to share ideas and ham radio related interests. So that's our current sort of social, technical kind of ham radio outlet. But previous clubs I belonged to, one of the best was the Boulder Amateur Radio Club, and they had excellent technical topics at their meetings and also fun social activities that they sponsored during the year, and even a couple of seminar type sessions at their meetings. They also sponsored a youth group called the Bark Juniors, and had some participation with that when our sons were in the junior high school age range, and they were actually part of that group too. So yeah, Colorado is, I don't know how it compares to other states particularly, but there is a very active ham community within the state, even in far-flung areas like Cortez is.
Are you involved with the amateur radio linking at all on FM? Do you have VHF or UHF mobile radio or DMR, anything like that? We do. We do have a couple of DMR radios. There isn't a real active repeater or entry into that network locally here. But we're hoping that that's going to change as time goes by. And you can access the network from higher points in the area, but it's not really at the point where it's as accessible as it is along, say, the Front Range part of the state at this point in time. Do you use a hotspot or something like that to use DMR?
No, it's just a standalone radio. There are some repeaters that you can access that have that capability, but again, you need to get to it's not a continuous coverage kind of a thing in this part of the state. There's higher points where you can get into the system and access it that way, or with a higher gain antenna, beam antenna.
When you Google AI8Z, what most of the references that you see were based on a 2007 program that you were involved in the 500 kilohertz band. Can you talk a little bit about what that was and why did it interest you?
Well, the The ARRL 600 meter effort was an experimental license that the league sponsored to explore the possibility of repurposing one of the former maritime ship-to-shore bands to ham use after they abandoned the requirement for CW operations on merchant ships in the late 1990s. And I'd always been interested in that part of the spectrum, particularly dating back to my seagoing experience. That was really the workhorse communication band for merchant ships. A lot of the traffic was handled in that part of the spectrum. And when that requirement went away, it was really intriguing that perhaps hams might get access to that or a portion of it. So I kind of kept my ear to the ground, and I saw an advertisement put forth by, I think it was the ARRL, and they were looking for participants with their experimental license. So I sent in the information and volunteered to be part of it and was accepted. And I got listed on the original license filing that they put in 2006, 2007 timeframe. And from there, set up a station and operated a number of modes and beacons for most of the next 10 years after that point in time.
And what kind of equipment did you use for the 630 meter band?
Well, it kind of evolved over time. Of course, it was all homebrew equipment. There really, especially at that point in time, there wasn't anything commercially available other than the old surplus shipboard equipment a couple of the people had. But I modified homebrew projects that I had that weren't being used, and most of it was tube-based in the beginning. The concern, really, it wasn't so much a interest in the vintage aspects of the effort as opposed to something that could withstand weather variations and mistuning the antenna and that sort of thing. I figured the tube was a better way to go and less chance of it being destroyed by high viswar and that sort of thing. So that was the basis of the station. And then as time went on, I added exciters like the Elecraft K2 with a transverter and used that as the signal source for a tube amplifier that I operated on the band.
And how much power did you run?
We were, under the terms of the license, we were allowed to run 20 watts ERP. And
really?
Because it doesn't sound like much power, but when you consider how inefficient antennas are, that, of the size that a typical ham could put up, that's actually quite a bit of power. And the highest power I was able to run with the equipment I had was about 1.5 watts ERP. And even at that, go ahead.
No. I was just going to say that's interesting. What kind of antenna would you, put out there for 630 meters? It sounds to me like it wouldn't be a dipole.
No, a dipole would be pretty impractical. Any kind of resonant antenna would be, I wouldn't say impossible. I'm always surprised at what other hams can come up with, but certainly for the typical ham, that would be just not an option. So the antennas I ended up using I started out with a shunt-fed tower, 60-foot tower, and it had some capacitive top loading using the guy wires and the beam antenna at the top of the tower. And it had a fairly extensive radial field at the base. And I used that probably the first several months I had access to the band under the experimental license. And it wasn't a particularly good performer. And I was encouraged by a former shipboard radio operator to try an inverted L configuration. And I was able to set that up in parallel with the shunt-fed tower. So the same night that I started operations with a beacon, I was able to switch over to the inverted L in real time, see what the incoming reports were on the signal levels, and that made a huge difference. I ended up using that inverted L configuration for the rest of the time span that I was on the air with the experimental license.
And now this message from QRP Labs. Hans Summers, G0UPL, informs me that he has sold over 5,000 QCX transceiver kits. I hope that in large part this is due to the promotion on the QSO Today podcast of this amazing single-board transceiver kit for under $50 from QRP Labs. The QCX is a feature-packed high-performance single-band 5-watt CW transceiver kit with whisper beacon and built-in alignment and test equipment tools. It is available for 80, 60, 40, 30, 20, or the 17-meter bands. It has a rotary encoder synthesized tuning, VFO A-B split, iambic keyer, CW decoder, and more. You can assemble this kit yourself with standard tools and a soldering iron. There are no surface mount components to solder, as the two SMD ICs are already factory pre-soldered on the board. Of course, Hans has a whole range of accessories to trick out this ride, using the language of hot rod cars. Since Hans has shipped over 5,000 QCXs, there is a rapidly growing community of builders and users who are fine-tuning the QCX in an open-source kind of way and sharing it with us on the Internet. So if you're ready to build your own rig, or want to save money, or just want that prepper rig for your bomb shelter, use the link on this week's show notes page to get to QRP Labs. Please use my link as it tells Hans that you heard about it here on QSO Today. QRP Labs is my favorite kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now, back to our QSO Today. And what kind of performance did you see on the 630-meter band, and how did you get reports back?
Well, initially, in the 2006 timeframe, they had a website that you could file signal reports on, but it was pretty much a manual kind of a system, so you needed people actively listening to the signals and then filing the reports online. Eventually, the K1JT software whisper software became available, and the 600-meter experimenter group took advantage of that and became part of that system. So it was much more automated. It really, I think, parallels or it's identical to the operations on the HF bands that people are using whisper. But it was a very powerful tool for the 600-meter experimenters, and it enabled us to run transmissions throughout the night and really pretty much 24/7 throughout the year, and continuously get signal reports from people all over the world. And in real time, you could look at the propagation on their website and see what sort of paths were open at any given time. So that really became the workhorse for people using that experimental license.
And in the end, what was the upshot of these experiments? Was the band opened to amateur radio operators, and are there people actually on there now, or was once the project terminated, that was the end of it?
Oh no, it really the purpose was to demonstrate that there was no interference issues with primary frequency allocations on that part of the spectrum, and we achieved that. I can't remember what the grand total. I think it was well over 100,000 hours of operation with zero interference complaints. And people that were particularly sensitive to that were the electrical utilities, and to a lesser extent, the Coast Guard and maritime users that still have primary access to that part of the spectrum. And I think through the 10 plus year time period that we operated under that license, being able to demonstrate that there were no interference issues with the power levels we were using, that really paved the way for justifying ham radio secondary access to the band. And that actually happened during work number 12, or work 12, in 2012, several countries immediately granted access to the band to their ham radio services. Unfortunately, the FCC was not one of them, and it took another several years, I think until 2016 or 2017, before U.S. hams actually got ham radio access to the band. But that is in effect now. There's a number of people using it, not just people that were involved with the experimental license. There's a number of newer arrivals, so to speak, and it sounds like it's become quite a interesting and popular activity for a segment of the hobby.
Do you think you'll return to 600 meters?
Yes, very much plan to do so, and my antenna upgrade planning efforts are aimed at that capability and being able to put the station back on the air from this location.
Did you find that 600 meters, is it affected by the sunspot cycle as much as the other bands are?
It is. I mean, everything radio-wise is affected by the sun, but its effects are really different than what you can experience on most of the other ham radio bands, with maybe a possible exception to the 160-meter band, but that's far enough away frequency-wise that characteristics are even different for 160 compared to 630 meters. I think you see most of the effects more at night than you do in the daytime. It's really affected by daytime absorption, but once the sun goes down and it's dark, that's when the really interesting things start to happen on 600 meters.
Now, what operating modes? Obviously, you were using Whisper for your test later on. What operating modes would you suggest are the operating modes that would lead to the most success on 600 meters?
Well, the allocation's wide enough that you can actually operate single sideband, but the antenna performance is typically narrow enough that even that becomes somewhat of a challenge. And so really the best modes to use and would give you the most success would be narrowband modes like CW and PSK31, and then maybe the new FT8 mode and some of the other JT9 modes or JT modes that Joe Taylor's come up with. Again, narrowband, low data rate kinds of things are really what have been proven to be effective on that part of the spectrum.
Now, I've seen these inverted L antennas for these low frequencies, and as I recall, there's some kind of, and maybe you can tell me what it is, what's the device at the bottom that looks like a coil rotating inside another coil? Is that something that you use?
I think what you're describing would be termed a variometer.
Oh, right, variometer.
That's a convenient way to vary inductance when you've got to come up with a lot of inductance to load an antenna. And it doesn't involve a sliding contact or other typical loss mechanisms in the coil. So for that reason, those are popular. And I didn't find it necessary to use that in my installation. I ended up using a tapped coil that was probably at one time part of a broadcast transmitter. And I was able to find a single tap on the coil that I could use that would allow me to tune across the whole band. But a number of people are using the variometers with homebrew coils, and that works quite well. You can, depending on how you set it up, you can easily cover the whole band with adjustments in that coil. So that component's part of what would be probably an L network for matching the impedance you would see with inverted L. And again, it's not a resonant antenna, so there's some reactance that needs to be dealt with when you're matching up to the transmitter. So and it's efficient and convenient to enclose those components at the base of the antenna. They take up a fair amount of room, and if you can do the matching there and get it down to 50 ohms, then it's it's real easy to run that back to the ham station. And I think a number of people are using that approach.
Well, that's pretty amazing. Your inverted L antenna, how long was the wire?
It was about 55 feet vertically and then about 380 feet horizontally.
So did you have to leave your property for the end of that wire?
No, I was able to. We had a large enough lot in the mountains that I could set that up on our own property. But that being said, there are a number of people using much smaller lot sizes or being able to fit their antennas into much smaller lot sizes using things like top loading and that sort of thing. They're able to get out within a number of adjacent states with that kind of an antenna and setup.
Can we go back to the variometer for a moment? As I recall, the variometer is like a couple of buckets with wires wrapped around them rotating one inside the other. They're interesting from a mechanical standpoint.
Yeah, they definitely are. And, from an electrical standpoint, you're applying principles like coupling coefficient and how the phase changes as you rotate one coil inside the other and how that affects the overall inductance of the combination. So it's really a neat both mechanical and electrical device. And, from a historical aspect, and you probably picked up on another interest of mine is historical or history type things. It's really a neat thing to see old technology being put into use with newer applications and sort of rediscovering things that people knew 100 years ago and have kind of forgotten about, or, things have evolved away from for whatever reason. And it still has its place today.
Curiously, if the 630 meter band was being used on ships, what kind of antennas did they use on the ships?
Well, that's a really good question. And it comes back to the things I had tried initially. The 60-foot tower would be similar to a vertical that they would run on some of the ships. And then the inverted L configuration was another really common shipboard antenna for that part of the spectrum. And if you think of a typical ship dimensions, it was not too far removed from what I ended up using for the majority of time on 630 meters. The 300, almost 400 foot long horizontal run with the 55 foot vertical portion was really almost identical to a typical ship installation for their antenna.
With a big antenna tuner at the bottom, or like on top of the pilot house.
Yeah. Typically that stuff was close to the bridge, and the older ships, the matching networks were actually in the radio shack or radio room. They actually do call that the radio shack on a ship. And as time went on, especially with the vertical antennas, they had a remote matching network, an auto tuner, so to speak, something that hams would recognize today. But they were using those commercial pieces of equipment back in the 70s when I was going to sea. So that was something that, automation was starting to kind of find an inroad on, even back in that period of time.
But they were using probably motor-driven controls rather than, like relay switched. Like I understand that you have a K2. So did you buy the K2 with the antenna tuner built in?
Yes, I've got the built-in auto tuner, and that is a relay-based kind of a thing. The shipboard equipment used a combination of relays and motor-driven, servo-type driven capacitors and inductors.
Have you found 600 megahertz shipboard equipment surplus and those antenna tuning arrays?
A number of people had access to those, but they're not very...
You'd think there'd be lots of them.
Well, there aren't that many merchant ships, first of all. A lot of them have been scrapped, and especially in that time period when they were transitioning from medium frequency Morse code to satellite-based communications, late 1990s. that's going on 20 years ago now, and a lot of those ships don't exist anymore. So wherever that equipment ended up, it was probably in scrap metal recycling areas. But there are a couple of the people on the band that, however they did it, I don't know, but they did get access to shipboard or shoreside maritime equipment that was repurposed for the ham band.
Yeah, you would think that, given the thousands of ships at sea through the years, that there would be a lot of equipment available, but it just never, probably it was looked at like the rest of the ship. It was a rusty bucket that needed to be taken apart.
Yeah, and I think it's more expedient to, when they scrap something like that out, to just, rip stuff out and put it in the appropriate metal pile. But to kind of get a feel for that or what's involved, I don't know if you're familiar with Maritime Radio Historical Society, but they maintain equipment and a station on the West Coast north of San Francisco that is basically, it's a museum. I mean, you go into the station and they've got storage rooms full of surplus components that came off of ships or other shoreside stations. And they use that to keep the equipment running at KPH, which is their legacy commercial station that they operate.
Are you involved in the Historical Society?
Yeah, I get their newsletter, and we've made donations to their effort. And a couple summers back, we actually got to visit the station and got the grand tour and got to see it in operation. It's really, I can't, anybody that has historical interest in radio, that's a must-see. You've got to go out to Point Reyes, visit KPH, and visit the staff there. And if you tell them you're a ham, they'll really give you the grand tour and show you you can poke inside the transmitters and even operate their ham radio station from their location there. I can't put into words what a fantastic resource and site that they operate there.
Well, I'm going to put that on my list the next time I get to the west coast of California.
And they have a fantastic website, and if you subscribe to their newsletter, you get a really good feel for what's involved with what they've done and the expertise and dedication that the people have that maintain that and keep that going.
Your wife, Janice, as you mentioned earlier, is N8SEW. So if I asked you the question, what kind of impact has amateur radio had on your family life, it looks like it worked out okay.
Well, I think it has. I don't know if you asked my sons that, what their view would be. One of them did go on to get his ham radio license, but he's not active. But it was involved with a number of our activities, especially with the Boy Scouts. And we did a number of jamborees on the air, and of course they participated in that. And then just camping trips, and at one time I had a mobile setup, and we used the station from that too, or the equipment from that.
Did your boys pursue technical careers?
Yes, both of them have pursued technical careers, and I like to think that exposure to the ham radio related things were encouragement for them to do that.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
I think the most exciting thing is the marriage of digital technology with traditional analog RF type components, and the capabilities that's enabled. And again, going back to the 630 meter effort, that's definitely the case with that. And I think you could point to just about any aspect of ham radio today that has an impact from the digital techniques and technology that are available to us today.
Would you agree that this is the most exciting time to be a ham?
I find that definitely to be the case. I think back to what we had available to us in the early 70s, technology-wise, frequency bands that we could operate on, and limited number of modes. It's a much different world than it was back in those days, and in terms of technology and what we have access to as hams.
Yeah, I've said in the past, I was out for about 25 years raising my kids and not being very active in amateur radio, and coming back to it was like Rip Van Winkle waking up and seeing a whole new world.
It is, most definitely. I can imagine it would be really difficult to even know where to start, I think, if you were away from it completely. Just the different modes that people are using, and they've dropped the Morse code requirement. Again, the impact that software and computers have had on the hobby, it's really a dramatic change, I think, from the old days.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. What advice would you give to new or returning hams to the hobby then?
Well, I would advise them to, if possible, get together with a local club or group of people and find out what's going on in your immediate area, and kind of test the water, see what sounds interesting, and use their help and advice to, making good decisions about what kind of equipment to get and modes to investigate and that sort of thing. I think that's a good starting point for people. And along with that, investigate online information sources like ARRL is a good starting point, and the publications that they put out could get you up to speed pretty fast as well.
Well, Mike, you've been a great guest. I really appreciate your joining me on the QSO Today podcast. And with that, I want to wish you 73, and thank you so much.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you, Eric.
73.
That's 73.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Mike. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information to the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in AI8Z in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages, or when you make your purchases, that you say that you heard it here on QSO Today. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Libsyn, and TuneIn, as well as the iTunes Store. If you own an Amazon Echo, you can say, "Alexa, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." I still use Stitcher to listen to podcasts on my smartphone. The links to all of these services are on the show notes pages on the right side. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.